from the Psych Hub Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Burnout Antidote, infusing well-being into the healthcare culture. I'm Paul Deger, joined by my ever-favorite co-host.
Hi, I'm Amy Pearlman.
Hey, Amy, what are we talking about today?
This week, we are continuing the conversation around all of the isms in the workplace and what that means to healthcare. We'll be talking about workplace discrimination and bias in healthcare.
Okay.
And you and I have talked about this quite a bit, but I wanted to bring the audience and the listeners to really think about how we've framed this in terms of setting the stage, thinking about what the larger system looks like, and then bringing it down to the individual level. Or I hate to think about things in that hierarchy of up and down, but really bringing this into what does that mean for the individual.
Yeah, I like that. So we've focused big picture before. Now we're coming in close and personal.
And I also just wanted to bring to that this is something that hits all of us. And even though these are difficult conversations to have, or may not be the most fun podcast episodes out there, I encourage listeners to stick with us, because this is something that affects all of us, intentionally, unintentionally, things we say, things we hear. It's an experience which is an ongoing journey for each one of us.
Yeah, and thinking about when it comes to burnout as a stress issue, we know that stress or discrimination plays a role within stress. And that idea of, if you think this is an episode you can skip, maybe all the more you need to listen, because you can have an impact in making a better workplace for all your colleagues. And the idea of, this culturally responsiveness, I know we've done some really wonderful work around that at Psych Hub, and recognizing words have power. And so I know I was used to talking about minority and majority, and recognizing that those words just don't quite speak to this topic. And so using marginalized for persons who have been harmed in some way due to their identification, the population that they identify with, or they're sort of pushed into that box. And then advantaged or privileged for folks like you and I, who are white individuals, middle class, cisgender. So those will be the words we'll be using today.
Great. I also like that in terms of addressing the multiple layers of our identity and the multiple layers of power dynamics. Shall we listen to some stories here?
We have 2 to listen to today, so let's take a listen.
As a foreign medical practitioner in the US, I feel that there's 2 main situations in which I could experience discrimination according to my heritage. First one would be patient-wise, and second one could be in the work environment, especially by superiors. First scenario, I remember when I have just arrived, I work at a research unit in which I do have to have patient contact to obtain their consent to enroll them in different clinical trials or studies. I remember this patient, I tried to approach him by phone, and his first answer to me was, "I need someone who speaks English. I don't understand you. I don't understand your accent." That felt a little bit too personal, and I keep with the conversation, and it was very frustrating because I know that he was understanding me. I know he was answering me my questions, but I feel that just because of my accent, he didn't want to establish a conversation with me. Since the phone situation didn't work because he was very emphatic that he wanted to speak to someone who, quote, speaks English, I decided to go with a partner of mine that is a US native person, and she was the one who helped me enrolling this patient into our study. But it was a clear situation that this patient wanted to be approached only by people who belong most to the US type of phenotype population. Second story, I remember presenting a topic of interest to a field of experts, and I remember I was stopped to one of the superiors on the table, a very well-renowned scientist in the workplace I I work with. And I remember he stopped me and he said that my idea wasn't that good because it lacked some structure, which is true, and it was a valid comment. And then he approached me saying that the reasons why Latinos do not succeed in science is because we are too passionate about what we do. So that is the second moment in which I felt a little bit discriminated according to my heritage. It's really hard to receive this type of feedbacks, even though it comes from a patient or from a superior, because I feel that for us immigrants, changing our comfort zone, which is our own countries, to challenge ourselves into these new situations that we're exposing ourselves, it's hard. It's already hard. I think that there's more good people than bad people in this world, and usually people are very receptive and they really want to establish a connection with you. These moments are, personally, I feel they are just horrible because it makes you question about yourself, about your capabilities, about what you can bring to the table. It makes you question if you're good enough for the situation. And it's sad that's the case, because just because of how you look or because how you speak, people are creating this huge judgment towards you as a person. And it's sad that people are exposing how they're trying to look someone else just because of those two small features.
I'm Valentina. I'm a young physician of Latin American origin who identifies proudly as a woman, and will briefly address the issue of workplace mistreatment, discrimination, and burnout. So many institutions started to develop strategies to identify the causes of burnout and work towards preventing, identifying, and safely recovering from it. For example, the American Medical Association came up with a recovery plan for physicians, and I am aware that its slogan, I believe, goes, "You took care of the nation, now it's time for the nation to take care of you." According to recent studies published by, some of medicine's most renowned journals, organizational efforts to mitigate the risk of burnout among physicians should include strategies that appropriately deal with and reduce mistreatment and discrimination. Nearly 30% of physicians are subject to ethnically offensive remarks. We believe even 30% said they experienced offensive sexist remarks, and data shows that female physicians and doctors from historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups are particularly prone to mistreatment and discrimination. Despite making significant strides toward gender equality, medicine still remains a male-dominated field, and women continue to face numerous challenges and obstacles. Discrimination against women in medicine takes place in many different forms and can happen from colleagues and from patients, even their families as well. Within the profession itself, female doctors face barriers in advancing their careers, such as competing for lead spots on a residency program, not being notified about openings for leadership positions or being passed over for promotions, receiving lower pays than their male counterparts, and experiencing limited access to professional development opportunities. Furthermore, women in medicine are more likely to experience mistreatment and bias from patients as well, as we are often subjected to disrespectful behavior, such as being interrupted during patient consultation, being questioned for our knowledge to the extent of sometimes asking for a male doctor to support our findings, and being targeted by unwanted sexual advances. Additionally, women in color in medicine do face a higher and even a greater challenge due to the intersection of gender and race discrimination, which is very unfortunate. Throughout my young career as a physician, I have faced different situations that have made it difficult for me to just accept and that discrimination is something and a pressing issue that continues to happen throughout just different hospitals everywhere. A short example would be residency. Residency spots in the United States, most of the residency spots, historically, were male dominated. So women had a relatively and very interestingly less spots than men to get into residency. And right now it has become, of course, against discrimination to work for giving women more residency spots, which has been interesting, and it's something that programs should do. However, recently I have heard different colleagues mentioned different match cycles for residency, and they mentioned, it seems this person matched and this person didn't match. It must probably be because this person is a woman, now they're trying to favor women, she must have matched because she's a woman. And they completely discourage or just not take into account the whole background of the person itself. Like in medicine, of course, we look with an integral person. You have to be good as a professional, good as a person, and the different spots are not the same for everyone. But of course, every candidate is unique and every candidate has a great background. So the fact that one person or another person does not get into a program is not just because she's a woman. It's not just because he's a man. And this just further explains how discrimination, it's actually a problem, because they shouldn't, like, the fact that a woman was able to get into a program doesn't mean they accepted her because she's a woman. It means because she's strong, because she's a great background, because she's very smart, because the grades are great, and it's a good person. So that just continues to explain to me how discrimination is an issue, not only here but worldwide. A recent issue that I heard of was that of female workplace discrimination, where a female physician had been experiencing like harassment from a male colleague. And this was particularly interesting because the issue was addressed as a cultural barrier, because in said culture, the women weren't supposed to talk against men or just stop men from making uncomfortable phrases or saying things to them. And this is the way the issue was addressed, instead of working towards making the female physician feel safe and feel comfortable in her own environment. And that's what I was told. And it's still like, it's a bit disappointing in a way. It's very disappointing because we continue to see how just discrimination in the workplace for women, which is really bad, because this person, of course, seems to not be able to continue with her duties completely or just focus on everything that person wants to do. It's not hard for women in these positions to speak out, and this continues to be an issue even in the 2023.
Those were really powerful. I hate to say that I enjoyed listening to them, but I really...
Say more, yeah.
Yeah, the message resonates for me.
Okay.
And helps me to think about this as more than a race issue, more than a gender issue, although it includes both of those.
Right.
But a sense of community and a sense of what does that mean for what we see and what we do,
yeah,
and what we hear. So kind of thinking about these passive roles and also the more active ones we have as well.
Yeah, that first story, the idea that he experienced it not only from his peers but his patients, and just thinking about this sense of mission and calling, and the exact people you're trying to help are then looking down on you in some way rather than looking at you as a healer, and how hard that would be to, you know, with the Hippocratic Oath, you're still there to heal regardless of how they look at you.
And the research that we've read, a lot of research at this point in the series, and I have tried to focus a lot on what is successful and what helps.
Yeah.
And the consistent things that seem to help have been a supportive workplace and the patient interaction, having that feeling of helping someone. And the example of the first man, that the first story that we heard, seemed to highlight challenges or discrimination with both of those groups.
Right. Yeah, and how that results in this questioning of self. And let's face it, especially if you're new to the field, the volume of information you're taking in and the skills you're trying to learn, there's already going to be question and doubt. But to then have the environment add more of that, you know, if anything, we know that we're going to have a crisis in this country around enough healthcare workers. We need all the skilled, knowledgeable people we can get. And so the sense of we really need to support people to shine and bring out their best. And what can I do to encourage that? That's the question that was coming up for me.
I appreciate that. I don't want to move into the action before we respond a bit to what the second story said. And one of the things the second story spoke to was how early these messages start.
Yeah.
And I think the first one even referenced it as well in a residency program.
Mm-hmm.
But thinking about the systemic level of residency, bringing this to a level of what does it mean to be a woman in the workplace and how our workplaces have changed.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we think that they have changed, I have still gotten questions in the workplace about how I manage as a mother.
Yeah.
Not in the sense of things that are directly related to work. So I could relate to that, thinking about when your child is sick, how do you respond? And that's not really an appropriate work question. So I started to resonate with that one a little bit. And I will own the white cisgender, maybe even middle-aged and middle-class components of this, but felt like the multiple levels started to feel resonate with me as a woman and as a mother.
A Pat Schroeder quote is coming to mind, which I don't know if I can exactly quote here. So she was the congressperson from Colorado once asked, how can you be a mother and I don't know if she's a senator. No, I'm sorry. And a congressperson. She had a beautiful response. I'll invite our listeners to look up, but she had no problem taking on that question. Like it was sort of I can't even, how dare you ask that question? So it had that quality to it. So I go ahead and look that one up.
I know, I'll look it up.
And I think about this idea of implicit bias. I remember taking that Harvard test a while back.
Yes,
and
I took it too.
Yeah, the idea of the waters that we swim in, maybe like that question about, how do you do your work if your child is sick? That and I'll speak for myself, until something is pointed out, I might miss it. And at that point I have regret for harm that I have done. And obviously I'm going to action again and willing to step up and not do it again. We need things pointed out. And it's not, but part of me then feels guilty about I'm asking people for help that have been harmed. But trust me, as a white cisgender male, I will take action and I have found even this past year or so working with you, Amy, and other folks, our communication guide at Psych Hub has really opened my eyes to that. I've been into words before that, but recognizing that simply swapping out one word can make a world of difference to that individual hearing it.
I have noticed it throughout the journey of this podcast, trying not to use the word burnout so much and trying to think about how do you think about how systems affect individuals.
Yeah.
And really moving into this understanding of using the right words, how that helps, and also being aware of my own actions. I think about this as the difference between macroaggressions and microaggressions. In our previous episodes where we talked about this, we talked more about the macro components.
Yeah.
And as this moved into micro, it's repeatedly, I worked somewhere where they repeatedly called a more junior staff person by the wrong name. The CEO called that person the wrong name over and over again.
Ugh.
And that really has this power move into it, which does not feel intentional, does not feel, it doesn't feel blatant in the same way, but it is a repeated action that makes that more junior staff person feel devalued in their work.
When I'm thinking culturally, and then how often is someone willing to speak up to the CEO about, hey, you're getting this person's name wrong. And so if we go back to this idea of we're looking at not just individuals, but shifting cultures, that sometimes that requires speaking up to power and being willing to do that. And then if you see your peers speaking up to power, supporting them in that. There's this wonderful video called The Power of the First Follower. And it's a scene at a concert. And one guy is standing up and dancing around all goofy. And what the person points out in the video is he's not the leader. The second person shows that this is something to emulate. And then the whole crowd comes with. So if you're not the person speaking up, being the first follower is just as important as the person speaking up.
I love that. I had a picture of like a wedding or a bar mitzvah and who's getting out on the dance floor.
Yeah, it was an outdoor concert, but we'll go with the bar mitzvah. That works too.
Yeah, just to bring in a little bit more of my culture, maybe.
Sure, there you go. That works.
Shall we move into what we can do in terms of taking action?
Yeah, what's our action for this week that will invite our listeners to join us in?
So this is another area of trying to think about an intentional psychological safety in the workplace for everyone, not just for ourselves. So you did give a bit of a spoiler alert to our implicit bias quiz. And there's a link in the notes. This is something that I took as well and really encourages you to investigate different parts of where your bias exists.
Yeah, because we all have biases. So let's just honor that.
We do. And I thought there may even be a next step on this one in terms of which quiz you choose to take. Do you take the one where you think you may have the most bias, or do you take the one where you think you're going to get
both
the least biased of a score?
Yeah.
But that's when I started getting into maybe you take both, but there are several. I encourage you to be thoughtful about which ones you take and what you do with that information that helps you to be more thoughtful or cautious about the words that you use in a way that you are part of creating that safety.
And Amy, I've got a closing note that I want to share. And I want to go all the way back to episode 1 with our buddy Tekla talking about being imperfectly perfect. Do I have that right? And that when you begin to explore this topic and behaviors, that allowing yourself to be imperfect on it, because it's going to be a skill like any others. And if we go, I'm going to be the self-compassion guy and call on the component of self-kindness, that allow yourself to screw this up. And that's okay, because that's how you learn to get it right, by working that edge of comfort and discomfort and exploring this with your colleagues and allowing yourself to be a learner here around how do we move the entire culture forward into this place of psychological safety for everyone.
Thank you, Paul. I like to think of this as avoidance is an action as well.
Ah, yes.
And perhaps the action we want to take today is the absence of avoidance.
Yeah. All right. I think I'm glad we took 3 episodes to really start big and then come down personal on this. And I hope we did right by you all out there.
Fingers crossed. Next week, we'll be back with another light topic of traumatic stress in healthcare environments.
And that's why we were doing the music early on, to lighten things up, but I can't think of any music, so we'll just roll. Thank you all. See you next week.
Thanks. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It allows others to find us and to join along. The Burnout Antidote is executive produced and edited by Jacob Morrison. Research is assisted by Tekla Ross. Show artwork was created by Ornella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. A very special thanks to Juliana Castro, Alyssa Fackler, Trevin Stiegel, Andrea Womack, and of course, our pet pickles. The Burnout Antidote is a co-production from PsychHub and is brought to you by Janssen Neuroscience.